Medieval castles, Medieval looked invincible from the outside, but living in one, that was a whole different story. Inside those mighty stone walls, life was cold. Not just grab a blanket cold, think, why are my teeth chattering in my sleep? Cold. There was no central heating, no radiant floors, no insulation. Yet somehow, kings and queens still called these freezing fortresses home. So, how did they stay warm? The truth is, they got very creative. Let's start with the walls. Thick stone walls made castles amazing defensive structures, but they were terrible at keeping warmth inside. Unlike wood, stone doesn't just get cold, it stays cold. A 3-foot thick stone wall in winter basically turned every room into a refrigerator. Imagine a medieval version of air conditioning, but it's January and you're wearing 6 layers. If castle walls could talk, they'd probably just chatter from the cold. And these places weren't quick to heat up either. There are records from Windsor Castle noting that fires burned for 2 straight days, and guests were still complaining about how cold it was. That's not a little drafty, that's why did I even bother lighting a fire. Territory. Royal fashion played a part in the heating strategy too. Kings often wore multiple layers of robes, not for style, but for survival. Turns out, hypothermia isn't a great look, even when you're wearing a crown. Now, about windows. You'd think windows might help bring in a little sun and warmth, but nope. Glass was expensive, so most windows were tiny slits, often covered with wood, oiled cloth, or even thin slices of animal horn. That didn't stop the wind, though. Even royal chambers had constant drafts. Honestly, the royal window maker must have had the easiest job. Nobody expected him to keep out the cold anyway. Then there were the ceilings, particularly in the great halls, where they soared as high as 40 feet. Any warm air from a fireplace? It went straight up. Meanwhile, everyone below was left to shiver. One medieval writer even complained that in the king's great hall, your face could be roasting while your back was literally freezing. That led to a tactic historians now refer to as throne zone heating. Essentially, only the spot your body touched, like the seat of the throne, actually got warm. The rest of the room, still ice cold. The floors didn't help either. Most were made of stone or packed dirt, both of which sucked heat out of the room. Walking barefoot on castle floors, you'd find out real fast that cold feet had nothing to do with wedding anxiety. In some northern castles, it got so cold that water left in basins overnight would freeze solid even in rooms with fireplaces that had been used the day before. And if that wasn't bad enough, the climate made things even worse. Between the 14th and 19th centuries, Europe went through what's now called the Little Ice Age. Winters were brutally cold. Rivers froze over regularly, so solid, in fact, that people held markets and festivals on the ice. The Thames River in London froze at least 23 times between 1309 and 1400. That's not just a cold snap, that's generations growing up thinking frozen rivers were normal. The size of castles also worked against them. Hampton Court Palace, for instance, had over 1,000 rooms. Just imagine trying to keep even a quarter of those warm. Guards working in cold corridors had to rotate shifts every hour to avoid frostbite. The clever ones figured out that being stationed near the kitchen was prime real estate in winter, to keep these massive spaces even slightly livable. Royal households went through an insane amount of firewood. One French king's winter records showed over 6,000 logs used in a single month, and people were still cold. Honestly, the safest job in the kingdom might have been being the guy who chopped the wood. He was probably the only one breaking a sweat in January, and no, kings weren't about to abandon their castles for a warm little wooden cottage. These towering stone structures were symbols of power. So, they needed warming strategies that matched that royal energy. The first and most obvious solution: fire, but not the cozy, crackling kind you'd have at home. Medieval castle fireplaces were gigantic. Some were so big you could walk into them standing up. Think fire rooms, not fireplaces. In royal castles, these hearths often measured 10 feet across and 7 feet high. At Bodiam Castle in England, the kitchen fireplace was a whopping 15 feet wide, basically the size of a modern bedroom. Of course, these weren't just for heating. They also came in handy when, let's say, you needed to dispose of some awkward documents related to an unsuccessful rebellion. But running these mega fireplaces wasn't cheap. Each could burn through an entire tree in a single day. Historical records show that royal castles went through up to 3 tons of wood per week during winter. That was just for the personal chambers. Forget whole castle coverage. The rest of the place stayed chilly. And for all their size, these fireplaces were incredibly inefficient. Their massive openings created powerful updrafts, sucking warm air up and out the chimney rather than into the room. Some estimates suggest that up to 80% of the heat went straight out the top. That medieval saying, "money burns," may vary. Well, have started with a king watching all his warmth disappear up the flue. And it gets worse. These fireplaces made a lot of smoke. Chimneys were large, but didn't always work well. Many castle rooms had a permanent haze, smoky air that stung the eyes and left the ceilings blackened with soot. Servants in charge of keeping these fires going had some of the worst jobs. Imagine hauling firewood all day, getting covered in ash, and battling smoke only to have the room still feel like a meat locker. But of course, one fireplace wasn't enough. Most castles had dozens. Dover Castle had 20 major fireplaces. The Tower of London, 32, and each one required constant tending. There were entire teams of workers whose only job was to keep those flames burning. Still, a huge fireplace was more than a heat source. It was a statement. The bigger your hearth, the richer and more powerful you appeared. Kings often had theirs decorated with coats of arms, carved stone, and even gold leaf. It was the medieval version of flexing. Placement mattered too. The main fireplace in a castle's great hall was always positioned at the far end, opposite the entrance. So when guests walked in, the first thing they'd see was a roaring fire, a warm, glowing symbol of royal might. And yes, over time, they did make some improvements. By the 14th century, fireplaces started featuring angled sides to reflect heat better. They also learned that raising the hearth a bit off the ground helped spread warmth. These tweaks sound minor today, but back then, that was high-end heating. Innovation. Still, even with all this firepower, castles stayed frigid. So kings had to keep stacking up ideas to survive the chill. So, massive fireplaces weren't cutting it alone. That's when medieval royalty leaned into their next secret weapon against the cold: textiles. And we're not just talking about rugs and blankets. We're talking full-scale fabric warfare against winter. First up, tapestries. You've probably seen them in movies, those massive, intricate wall hangings with knights and hunting scenes. Hanging thick woolen fabric on the walls helped trap heat inside and block cold from radiating in through the stone. They were the medieval version of thermal panels. These tapestries didn't just hang flat. They were mounted slightly away from the wall, creating a little air gap. That pocket of trapped air acted as another layer of insulation. It's the same principle modern insulation uses today. Turns out, medieval lords were way ahead of their time, and there were a lot of tapestries. Castle inventories often listed hundreds of them. Westminster Palace alone had more than 300 in the 14th century, with over 50 just in the king's private rooms. The guy might not have had a flushing toilet, but he had wool on every wall. These tapestries were so valuable and important that when kings and queens traveled between castles, they brought them along. Royal wagons were literally loaded just with wall hangings. A whole team of servants was responsible for rolling, packing, transporting, and rehanging these portable heaters. High maintenance, for sure, but if it meant a 10-degree boost in your bedroom, worth it. Bed curtains were another major textile defense. Royal beds weren't just big, they were built like fabric fortresses. Heavy drapes surrounded the entire bed, creating a miniature warm zone. When closed, these curtains trapped body heat, like a medieval version of a sleeping bag, but way more glamorous. And they didn't skimp on material. Some royal beds used up to 50 yards of fabric for just one set of curtains. Outer layers might be velvet or thick wool for warmth, with inner layers of silk for softness and luxury. The goal: keep the cold out, keep the heat in, and look fabulous doing it. Fur was another line of defense and a big status symbol. Common folk might line their clothes with rabbit or squirrel fur, but royalty, they went all out with ermine, sable, and marten, some of the rarest and most expensive pelts available. A single fur-lined royal robe could contain the skins of hundreds of animals. These weren't just garments, they were walking heat sources, each one costing more than most peasants earned in 2 decades. But textiles didn't stop with walls and wardrobes. The floors got the royal treatment too. Cold stone pulled heat away from the body. So castles used Russia's long grasses spread across the floor to create a soft, warmer surface. In royal chambers, those rushes were often swapped out for woven mats or imported carpets, which offered better insulation and a much-needed layer between noble toes and freezing rock. In fact, some rooms had a dozen rugs layered up like insulation. Lasagna, and yes, these were considered a luxury beyond belief. Most people in medieval Europe went their entire lives without ever seeing a carpet. Even walls that didn't get tapestries were dressed up. Cloth hangings, called dorsers, were placed behind chairs or benches, so when someone leaned back, they weren't pressing against an icy wall. Windows, too, got textile makeovers. Thick woolen curtains helped block out drafts, and castle accounts frequently list window cloths and door hangings purchased specifically to seal in heat. Altogether, these layers on walls, beds, floors, windows, and people could increase a room's temperature by up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That might not sound like much now, but in a castle with no central heat, That was the difference between comfort and misery. It's no wonder that managing textiles was a full-time job. Royal households had entire departments just for this purpose, hiring spinners, weavers, embroiderers, and cleaners. The textile crew was one of the most expensive and essential parts of the medieval royal staff. Still, fabric could only do so much. When rooms remained stubbornly cold, medieval royalty turned to another clever trick, leveraging kitchens as heating systems. Castle kitchens were the warmest places in the entire structure, not just because of the massive cooking fires, but because they were designed to run all the time. Even when no one was baking bread or roasting boar, those flames kept burning. Ovens needed to be hot and ready, especially in winter. The result? A reliable, continuous heat source, 24/7, and we're not talking a stovetop and a single oven. Kitchens in castles like Windsor were industrial operations. The kitchen complex alone was larger than a modern basketball court, filled with multiple fireplaces, bread ovens, roasting pits, you name it. Some hearths could roast 6 or 7 whole animals at once. Kitchen heat didn't stay confined either. Castle designers got smart. They often placed living quarters near or even above the kitchens so that the warmth would radiate into those spaces. Some royal bedchambers even shared a wall with the kitchen, turning dinner prep into an impromptu heating system. And in truly cold winters, royals sometimes slept above the kitchen, directly benefiting from the rising warmth. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. A chilly royal might call for a midwinter kitchen suite. Staycation. Architects also designed heat pathways. Food didn't just travel from kitchen to dining room. It passed through a network of antechambers and service corridors, and those rooms soaked up the residual warmth. Walls between kitchens and dining areas often had warming compartments built in little alcoves where food could sit and stay hot before being served, while also warming adjacent rooms. It was efficiency by design, and sure, the side effect was that your bedroom might smell like roast duck or baking bread, but honestly, in the middle of winter, that was a fair trade. Some castles even routed water pipes through kitchen areas to prevent freezing. That way, during the coldest months, the water in those pipes didn't turn to ice. These kitchen-adjacent plumbing lines were often the only running water still usable in winter. But even with clever kitchen heat, the warmth didn't stretch all the way to the farthest towers or outer halls. For the truly luxurious solution, medieval engineers went back in time, borrowing technology from ancient Rome. Enter the hypocaust system, the medieval version of heated floors. Yup. Some royals had underfloor heating in the Middle Ages. Hypocausts worked by channeling hot air through open spaces beneath the stone floors. Fires were lit in a furnace room, and the heat moved through brick tunnels and support columns underfoot. The result? A floor that actually radiated warmth upward into the room. It was slow to heat, sure. You had to light the furnace hours in advance. But once it got going, it created a steady, comfortable warmth that lingered. No more hopping across ice-cold tiles to get to bed. It was the medieval equivalent of radiant floor heating, and it was glorious. Of course, it wasn't cheap. Hypocausts required tons of labor and over 4,000 specialized bricks and tiles to install, not to mention a constant fuel supply. A single hypocaust chamber could burn through as much wood in a day as a small village used in 2 weeks. No surprise. These systems were reserved for only the richest royals and most critical rooms. They also weren't without problems. Poorly cleaned systems leaked smoke or worse, carbon monoxide. Some records even mention nobles dying in their sleep from faulty hypocausts. Heating luxury came with risks, but when they worked, they could maintain rooms at a tropical P-70 degrees Fahrenheit in the dead of winter, while the rest of the castle hovered closer to 45 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That might not sound like much now, but back then, it was like entering the sauna of kings. Even with giant fireplaces, endless textiles, and underfloor Roman-inspired heating systems, medieval castles still had one persistent problem: they were cold. No matter how many logs burned or how thick the furs got, there were still rooms that felt like ice caves. So, royalty turned to one more powerful source of warmth, one that didn't cost a thing: people. Human bodies generate heat constantly, and medieval castle dwellers weren't about to let that go to waste. When it got especially frigid, one of the simplest and most effective ways to warm a space was to fill it with warm bodies. Literally, the Great Hall, the center of castle life, was actually designed to be packed with people. During feasts or events, these vast rooms might hold 300, 400, even 500 guests, and when that many bodies gathered, the temperature could rise by 10 to 15 degrees. Just from body heat alone. Records from winter celebrations often note that guests would arrive wrapped in heavy cloaks and multiple layers, but by the end of the evening, those same guests were sweating, fanning themselves, or cracking open the drafty windows. Not because of the fire, but because of the sheer collective warmth of all those people. It was a brilliant system. Planning a big feast in the middle of January that wasn't just about politics or religion. That was strategic castle heating. Royal calendars from the Middle Ages show an interesting trend: more events, more festivals, and more large gatherings during the coldest months of the year. It's like the medieval version of crowdsourcing, but instead of raising money, you're raising the indoor temperature. Feast at the castle tonight was often code for please come be part of our human heater. Even daily routines reflected this people-powered heating system. Servants were intentionally assigned to sleep near important rooms, not just for security or convenience, but because their body heat would help warm nearby walls and floors. The queen's ladies, their chambers were often placed next to or even attached to the royal bedroom. They weren't just assistants, they were human insulation. The same was true for pages and squires housed near the king's chamber. When your stone walls acted like an open refrigerator, any nearby body helped. Sleeping arrangements changed with the seasons, too. In summer, nobles might spread out, enjoying private chambers, but come winter, everyone clustered. Even high-ranking nobles, who usually demanded personal space, would triple up to share warmth. Pride had nothing on frostbite. Some royal household accounts even show that in winter, fewer rooms were used, but those that were used got significantly more firewood and were packed with more people. Less space, more heat. It was basic, but it worked. Now, let's talk beds. Today, we have foam, insulation, electric blankets. Back then, beds relied almost entirely on the heat of the people in them. And in some cases, that meant more than just the lord or lady. Enter one of the strangest and warmest jobs in the castle, the bed warmer. No, not a pan full of hot coals. We're talking about an actual human whose job was to climb into the royal bed first and warm it up before the noble climbed in. You think your job is weird? Some royal household documents even list this as an official duty. Your title might translate to something like chamber hearth assistant, but everyone knew you were the one warming the blankets with your body. Probably not a lifelong dream, but hey, job security. And they didn't stop at people. Dogs played a role to big, warm, loyal ones. Most castles kept packs of hunting hounds, and when they weren't out chasing game, they were inside, sleeping by the hearth, or even in the beds of their masters. These weren't lapdogs, they were walking, breathing space heaters. The term three-dog night, that's not just the name of a band. It comes from old slang meaning a night so cold you needed 3 dogs in bed with you just to stay warm. In fact, some royal inventories actually list specific rugs or bedding areas for dogs placed strategically near the thrones or royal sleeping areas. These dogs weren't just pets, they were essential parts of the heating plan. And let's not forget one of the most overlooked but surprisingly helpful heat sources, candles and torches. They were everywhere in a castle, on walls, in sconces, on tables, lining the halls. Their main job was to provide light, but each one also gave off a little heat. Not much, sure, but dozens, hundreds, it added up. A grand winter feast might feature hundreds of candles and flaming torches. And while they didn't turn the hall into a sauna, they definitely took the edge off the chill. The medieval version of adjusting the thermostat, just light 50 more candles. There's even a record of a Christmas banquet where the hall got so warm from the crowd, the fire, and all the candles that they had to open the windows in December, looking at all these clever, layered strategies, from roaring fireplaces and tapestry-covered walls to sleeping dogs and packed feast halls. You get a sense of just how creative medieval castle life had to be. These weren't modern homes with thermostats and double-pane windows. They were massive stone fortresses that leaked heat like sieves. Every trick, every design, tweak, every cozy curtain was part of a larger plan to survive winter with at least some feeling in your toes. And, in a strange way, all this effort highlights something kind of beautiful: how much work people put into comfort, connection, and community. Staying warm in a castle wasn't just about firewood. It was about where you sat, who you slept near, what you wore, and even who you invited over for dinner. Sure, these strategies might seem outdated now, even primitive, but they remind us that comfort has always been a human pursuit. Whether it's lighting a candle or cramming 400 people into a hall to turn it into a sauna, warmth, real, physical warmth, was worth the effort. So the next time you turn up your heat, throw on a fleece blanket, or complain about a drafty room, remember the kings and queens who layered fur over silk, wrapped themselves in tapestries, snuggled with dogs, and filled banquet halls, all just to keep the cold at bay. Because, in a medieval castle, staying warm wasn't just about fire, it was about everything.